Some criticisms of Marxism. Part 6. Marxism's predictions never came true. As was discussed in the previous video, the Marxist contention that the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer under capitalism is a fundamentally flawed assertion. It was a prediction that in no way came to fruition. In a similar way, nearly all of Marxism's other predictions never came to be. Marxism predicted that the wealthiest of the bourgeoisie would create vast monopolies, corporate empires that would funnel money hand over fist to the wealthy owners. Private companies would squeeze out any and all competition, consolidating control over entire sectors of the economy. This prediction largely did not come to pass. It is true that monopolies exist and have existed in the past. For instance, natural monopolies exist around the world and throughout time. According to Investopedia, a natural monopoly is, quote, a type of monopoly that exists due to the high startup costs or powerful economies of scale of conducting a business in a specific industry. A company with a natural monopoly might be the only provider or a product or a service in an industry or geographic location. Natural monopolies can arise in industries that require unique raw materials, technology, or similar factors to operate, unquote. If one were to drive through the small towns in southern Utah and Colorado or northern Arizona and New Mexico, one would come across many towns in which there are natural monopolies. For instance, in Mexican Hat, Utah, there is one Shell gas station. In Gray Mountain, Arizona, there is likewise one gas station. Similarly, in Bedford, Wyoming, there is likewise only one gas station. These communities are small enough that they can be properly serviced by only one of these providers. It may be too expensive or the market share too small to warrant another business. However, these kinds of small-town natural monopolies are not the same monster described by Marxism. Monopoly, in the Marxist sense, are those companies who, quote, collectively dominate the economy as a whole, unquote. These kind of monopolies have existed and do exist. However, it should be noted that every one of these institutions have been either established and or supported by state actions. The Dutch and British East India Companies were state-backed monopolies to assist European imperial ambitions, as well as to support mercantilist policies. While technically private, they were deeply entwined with state initiatives and had their monopolies protected through state violence. The De Beers Corporation, at a given point, had roughly 90% of the global market share of diamonds. For decades, one company essentially determined the price of diamonds around the world. However, what is often overlooked is how this British company gained its monopolistic power. Founded by Cecil Rhodes, one-time governor of the Cape Colony and influential imperialist, the De Beers Corporation gained exclusive rights to diamond mines in Africa from various colonial powers. In Sierra Leone, for instance, the British Empire granted De Beers a complete monopoly for 99 years. A state-backed monopoly that was enforced through violence and coercion. These are not examples of free markets in action. They are not examples of capitalism creating monopolies. Furthermore, in a free market, monopolies in the Marxist style are nearly impossible to create. Because of competition and innovation within the free market system, it is nearly impossible to create monopolies or cartels without the assistance of government interference. For one thing, if a set of firms attempted to coordinate together to fix the price of a given good at an artificially high point, there would be every incentive for each individual firm to break the agreement and lower the price, thus undercutting the attempted cartel. It is a prisoner's dilemma that would be difficult to solve. Outside of the context of price-fixing cartels, there are often concerns about major companies themselves becoming monopolies. Routinely, there are cries of concern about Amazon or Apple or Google achieving monopolies. However, what is often forgotten is that these kind of cries of concern have occurred frequently and often with very different companies depending on the decade. In the 1970s, there were concerns surrounding IBM. In the 1980s, Kmart was the boogeyman. In the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, there were worries around Walmart. Yet, what is often overlooked is the propensity of the creative destruction of the free market to fell commercial Goliaths. The International Business Machine Corporation, IBM, was established in 1928 and was an early and key innovator in computing technology. For the next 6 decades, IBM held a near monopoly on the computing industry in the United States and around the world. For years, the assumption was that IBM would continue to be dominant. Indeed, some were concerned that IBM was becoming a monopoly. This was the state of affairs until Microsoft entered the scene. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Microsoft surpassed the giant IBM. The following graph shows the stock prices of both Microsoft and IBM over time. When Microsoft started, IBM was the giant of the industry. Many believed it ridiculous for any company to try to challenge IBM. As of May 22, 2020, IBM's stock price was $118.39 per share. The stock price of Microsoft was $183.51 per share. IBM was not Microsoft's only competitor. Microsoft went up against many other large tech companies that had enough market share to cause Microsoft concern. Microsoft is not secure in its position on the top of the heap. These include businesses like Oracle, Lotus, Sun Microsystems, Novell, and more recently, Apple, Amazon, Google, Cisco, Sony, VMware, and Salesforce. All are challenging Microsoft for dominance. Another example can be seen in the early days of the video game industry. Atari dominated the American video game console market in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They sold millions of consoles, including the Atari 2600 and the Atari 5200, as well as millions of game cartridges. Atari won many awards for their best-selling games, like Pitfall, Pac-Man, and Grand Prix. Atari was so dominant in the early 1980s that the 1982 film Blade Runner prominently features Atari billboards in its dystopian cyberpunk future of 2019. Yet, within a year, the video game crash of 1983 laid Atari low, giving rise to Nintendo's dominance for the next decade. And yet, even Nintendo does not stand unchallenged. Sega, Sony, and Microsoft all would compete with the Japanese video game giant. As of this writing, Sony's PlayStation 4 and Microsoft's Xbox One directly compete with Nintendo's Switch. Among chain stores, the same phenomenon can be observed. In 1980, Milton Friedman appeared on The Phil Donahue Show to promote his book and documentary, Free to Choose. During the question and answer session of the interview, a young woman asked Friedman about Kmart's skyrocketing rise, threatening the market share of Sears.
I worked for Sears for 2.5 years, and every day I went past a little board that said Kmart 31, Sears 19, 21. And I was just wondering what happened.
What do you mean, the price of the stock?
Yeah. Yeah, they quoted it, and it was just...
I know, I've seen it all the time.
And I was in profit sharing, and I kind of started to wonder, with all Sears pushing to sell and to produce and just to be marvelous, what happened? Why is Kmart?
Why is Kmart? I'm not a business expert. I don't know why Kmart went ahead of Sears. If I knew that, I'd be in a different business. All I know is that they managed to appeal to the consumer. They made better decisions about what products to sell than Sears did. Now, who was responsible or why? You'd have to be an expert. In a way, I'm not.
Kmart was better at discounting than Sears.
Well, fine. That's what consumers wanted. Fine. Then they served the consumer.
Didn't when Sears decided that it would approach or broach the issue of the arena of discounting, their sales shot up.
Well, they still
but their profits diminished.
I don't know anything about the details. For all I know, Sears is streamlined. It's going to go and beat Kmart. I don't have the slightest idea. Let the market decide.
The irony of this question, when hearing it asked in 2020, is that both Sears and Kmart are experiencing a death spiral. Hundreds of stores have closed in the last decade. As of November 2019, only 182 Sears or Kmarts existed in the United States. Milton Friedman appeared on The Phil Donahue Show twice, in 1979 and 1980. Both interviews feature such ironic discussions of corporate giants becoming monopolies. They discuss various airline, automobile, and other companies that have since become extinct or irrelevant. Brick and mortar stores, long the mainstay of American commerce, have suffered losses across the board. New technologies like the internet have revealed new consumer preferences. To the extent that such businesses still exist, they must adapt to new market conditions to remain viable. Blockbuster, Macy's, Sears, Kmart, Barnes & Noble, Borders, among many other traditional businesses, have been unable to learn this lesson. The S&P 500 index lists the top 500 companies in the New York Stock Exchange. The S&P 500 was established in 1957, and by 2007, 83% of the original companies listed were no longer on the list. Over the course of 50 years, only 86 companies originally listed were still in the S&P 500. In a free market, there is a natural ebb and flow as companies are born, compete, and die. Arguably, every single company will eventually go out of business, given a long enough timeline. This trend is wonderfully demonstrated by a content creator on YouTube called Company Man. In his series about the decline of businesses, Company Man demonstrates that even the greatest of commercial giants are often laid low. This is the creative destruction of the free market that makes monopolies impossible, completely contradicting one of Marxism's key predictions. Furthermore, not only is Marxism's conception of the free markets leading to monopolies fundamentally flawed, its very conception of the structure of business is largely antiquated. Serge L. Levitsky writes in his introduction to Das Kapital, quote, "The rapid growth and extension of joint stock companies have all but eliminated the individual capitalist owner who was the prime target of Marx's attacks. The tycoon has been replaced by the professional manager who does not own the capital." Unquote. Directly connected to this were the observations previously made about how life actually improved for the vast majority of people within capitalist societies. Far from living in squalor, the average person living in capitalist societies live far better than their forefathers ever did. In the United States, for instance, nearly every person has a refrigerator. 23% of Americans have two or more. According to the United States Department of Energy, 75% of American homes have air conditioners. 95% of American families own a car. 85% use their cars to drive to work every day. At its height in 2014, 85% of Americans had cable television. This has declined to 75% in 2019, as more Americans are switching to streaming services. In 2019, 90% of Americans used the internet. By 2015, 49% of American adults had played a video game at least once. By 2017, there were over 89 million video game console users. 155 million Americans play video games, and 80% of households own a video game device of some kind. The list goes on and on. The average American is vastly wealthier than royalty 2 centuries or even a century ago. This growth of the middle class in capitalist societies completely and utterly contradicts the basic tenets of Marxism and Marxist predictions. Serge L. Levitsky observes this directly. He writes, quote, Nor did Marx foresee that the middle class, far from being reduced to the status of the proletariat by the operation of the law of capitalist competition, would actually enjoy a remarkable consolidation of its position and broadening of its bases. Today, because of the increased prosperity of the workers, there is a steady influx of laboring people into the middle class. This new middle class is acquiring shares in the capital and thus has a vested interest in the perpetuation of the modern capitalist system, not its downfall." Unquote. Because of this growth in the wealth of the average person is not at the beck and call of their employers. Indeed, the average American could expect to see changing jobs 11 to 15 times in their lifetime. The capitalists are not the lords of the earth, the way that the Marxism predicted. Levitsky notes, quote, "The workers themselves, the proletarians, as Marx liked to call them, stand no longer helplessly facing the all-powerful capitalist." Unquote. Another key prediction that Marxism made was that socialist and communist economies would be far more productive than the capitalist mode of production. Lenin clearly believed this to be the case. Lenin wrote, quote, "Expropriation of the capitalists will inevitably result in a gigantic development of the productive forces of human society." Unquote. This prediction, far from coming to pass, the exact opposite happened. The communist nations were all crippled economically due to programs sponsored by the regimes. As was demonstrated in the previous video, the economies of both the USSR and the People's Republic of China were fractions of the capacity of the United States. Furthermore, as was previously demonstrated, their economies were less capable than even other developing nations like Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. There are many stories of Soviets visiting American grocery stores and believing that such stores were Potemkin villages. Soviets visiting such stores believed that they were propaganda pieces rather than the average grocery store. Other communist nations likewise saw poor economic performance. Cuba, before the revolution, was one of the most prosperous nations, not only in Latin America, but also in the world. In 2009, Cubans were unable to obtain toilet paper due to massive shortages. Cuba, as part of an industrialization drive, attempted to achieve unrealistic quotas of sugar production, a policy that resulted in a near collapse of their entire economy. Venezuela, though not strictly a communist nation, nevertheless has styled itself as socialist. Calling himself the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution, Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 and ruled until his death in 2013, a hand-picked successor taking over following his death. After Chavez's death, actor Sean Penn eulogized him, saying, quote, "Today the people of the United States lost a friend it never knew it had, and poor people around the world lost a champion. Venezuela and its revolution will endure under the proven leadership of Vice President Nicolas Maduro." Unquote. American documentarian Michael Moore likewise praised Chavez. In a 2009 tweet, Moore wrote, quote, "Hugo Chavez declared the oil belonged to the people. He used the oil money to eliminate 75% of extreme poverty, provide free healthcare and education for all." Unquote. Soon after Chavez's death, the Venezuelan economy hit a death spiral. Inflation at a given point hit 80,000%. 90% of Venezuelans are living in poverty. Stores were bereft of food and other necessities. Many tried to buy rotten food or even hunting dogs in the streets of Caracas. Around 3 million Venezuelans have fled the country. At a given point, the only thing keeping the Venezuelan economy going was the smuggling of staples like rice, flour, powdered milk. One smuggler noted that, quote, "Moving a shipment of milk is more profitable than cocaine," unquote. Faced with mounting pressure, the regime cracked down on protesters, killing hundreds. In one horrific incident captured on video, Venezuelan National Guard trucks ran down protesters. Besides poor economic performance, the communist nations saw massive famines due directly to the policies of the regimes. In Ukraine, during the Holodomor, around 6 million people starved to death. In China, during the Great Leap Forward, at least 45 million people starved to death. The famine was entirely due to communist policies. The party's secretary of Xinjiang district reported, quote, "The problem is not that food is lacking. There are sufficient quantities of grain, but 90% of the inhabitants are suffering from ideological difficulties," unquote. Furthermore, following the Great Leap Forward, quote, "China's national productivity fell by as much as 25%, unquote. Not only did Marxism predict that communist societies would be more economically productive, Marxism also predicted that such societies would be freer than capitalist societies. This prediction was wildly incorrect. Most of the communist nations devolved into totalitarian nightmares. Much of this topic will be expanded upon in later videos, but it is worthwhile to discuss it briefly here. Marx and Engels, as they were organizing communist movements in Europe, declared themselves to be anti-authoritarian and anti-state. Marx once wrote that, quote, "When Engels and I first joined the secret communist society, we made it a condition that everything tending to encourage superstitious belief in authority was to be removed from the statutes," unquote. Indeed, according to historian A. James Gregor, Marx and Engels, quote, "never attributed to that anticipated elite anything like the responsibilities Lenin assigned to his revolutionary vanguard," unquote. Lenin, likewise, colored himself as being anti-authoritarian and anti-state. Throughout his work, State and Revolution, Lenin predicts that communism would inevitably lead to the withering away of the state to be replaced by a stateless and classless society. Even before the state withers away, Lenin claims that under socialism, the state would be reduced to insignificance. Lenin writes, quote, "We workers ourselves, relying on our own experience as workers, establishing a strict and iron discipline, supported by the state power of the armed workers, shall reduce the role of the state officials to that of simply carrying out our instructions as responsible, moderately paid managers," unquote. Despite purpled prose, the communist regimes, in reality, became totalitarian nightmares on par with, or even surpassing, the fascist regimes. The Soviet gulags were made infamous by the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. What is often forgotten, however, are the Chinese laogai that fulfilled much the same role. Even to this day, the People's Republic of China is sending people to concentration camps. More recently, the Uyghur population has been targeted. This will be expounded upon later in another video. Similarly, Cuba made infamous the UMAP prisons, and the old Spanish fortress La Cabana became the site of thousands of executions without trial. North Korea, for the last half-century, has essentially been one massive slave state. Essentially, the entire country is, in and of itself, a giant concentration camp. Attempting to flee is punishable by death. Much of these examples will be expanded upon in later videos. Suffice it to say here that the Marxist prediction that communism would lead to more freedom was wildly incorrect. The 20th century was largely defined by its body count. The communist regimes contributed at least 100 million bodies to that pile. Arguably, the most significant prediction that Marxism made was that the proletariat would inevitably rise in revolution and smash the bourgeoisie, seizing the means of production for themselves. This revolution would be global and would first begin in the most advanced industrial nations. Every aspect of this prediction never came to pass. Indeed, the opposite happened. For one thing, as has been discussed several times in this video, the average person saw their standard of living rise dramatically, along with their own personal wealth. For one thing, the idea of class consciousness, which was so vital to Marxist analysis, is a largely antiquated notion. For one thing, the capitalist class themselves do not necessarily have consciousness. This can be seen in the ways in which capitalists and corporations compete and undermine one another for the sake of market share. For instance, in the example of net neutrality, many companies find themselves opposed to one another. Many internet service providers find themselves opposed to companies like Facebook, Amazon, and Netflix. Not only do the capitalists not have class consciousness, neither do the proletariat. Levitsky observes that, quote, as prosperity grows, class consciousness tends to disappear. Modern capitalist society is in the process of establishing a common denominator for all men, irrespective of their social origin, by the standardization of living conditions and of ways of life, and by creation of equal opportunities for all, unquote. Directly connected to this idea of class consciousness was the Marxist prediction that as inequality grew in capitalist society, as the proletariat were squeezed and increasingly exploited, Marxism predicted that the state would increasingly crack down on the proletariat. The state would, at the behest of the capitalists, crush protests from the proletariat. This has largely been an inaccurate prediction, particularly in Western industrialized and capitalist societies. Levitsky observes, quote, as prosperity grows, government intervention becomes increasingly unnecessary and even odious to an increasing majority of people, unquote. While there are certainly authoritarian tendencies in the modern state, and while many disagree with various government policies, Western liberal democracies are hardly comparable with the authoritarian regimes of the past. Connected to the idea of class consciousness was the prediction that the proletarian revolution was to be global and was inevitable. In the same way that gravity pulls a boulder down a mountainside, tumbling and crashing through the trees, so too will the laws of history push the proletarian to smash the bourgeoisie. Nothing could be done to stop this, nor could anything be done to accelerate it. Friedrich Engels wrote, quote, revolutions are not made deliberately and arbitrarily, but that everywhere and at all times they have been the necessary outcome of circumstances entirely independent of the will and the leadership of particular parties and entire classes, unquote. However, this has never been the case. Not a single communist revolution was carried out by the people. Every communist revolution was led by a small cabal of professional revolutionaries. Lenin described them as the vanguard, whose duty was to educate and to lead the proletariat in revolutionary socialism. These groups acted as a spearhead to force communism on the societies they took over. This can be seen clearly in Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia, among others. In other nations, like in Eastern Europe, communism was imposed upon those societies from outside communist forces. Levitsky observes this trend directly when he writes, quote, in fact, all governments which today claim to embody the teachings of Marx and to have carried out successfully the transition to the dictatorship of the proletariat owe their position to the action of minority groups, which was neither supported nor ratified by the vast majority of the proletariat, unquote. Communism was not achieved through the will of the people. Communism was imposed upon the masses from a politically motivated minority from above. Marxism predicted that the first dictatorships of the proletariat would be established in the most economically and industrially advanced nations. Marxists expected the revolution to begin in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. Marx wrote in 1872, quote, America will be the workers' continent par excellence, unquote. This prediction, likewise, proved to be completely incorrect. Rather than begin in the most advanced nations, the communist revolutions all occurred and were successful in nations that were considered to be so-called backwards. Tsarist Russia was hardly an industrialized nation. Up until 1905, nearly 80% of the population were peasants in an empire of 126 million people. Similarly, every single nation that became a communist dictatorship or otherwise subscribed to Marxism-Leninism were all largely agricultural and underdeveloped economies. China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, Eastern Europe, Ethiopia, Somalia, Afghanistan, among others, were all not peak industrialized nations. Furthermore, many of the communist guerrilla movements around the world likewise took place in largely rural or agricultural nations: El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Angola, the Congo, among many others. Historian A. James Greger observes this trend of communist movements very directly. Greger writes, quote, "Where traditional Marxism had predicted revolution in the advanced industrial nations, Marxism-Leninism orchestrated revolution in the industrially least developed regions of the globe. Marx and Engels anticipated revolution undertaken by populations, the vast majorities of which would be sophisticated urban proletarians. The revolutionaries of the 20th century gathered illiterate peasants in rural settings to the cause." Unquote. These historical facts completely contradict the predictions that largely form the core of Marxism. The revolution of the proletarian never occurred. At least, it did not occur in the advanced industrialized nations, let alone globally. The Soviet Union collapsed. The People's Republic of China has been liberalizing its economy for the last 3 decades and is a major trade partner with the United States. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have all transitioned towards free market capitalism. In Germany, the birthplace of Karl Marx, the Social Democratic Party, the party Marx helped to form, have been publicly distancing themselves from Marxism. Quote, Erich Ollenhauer, the chairman of the German Social Democratic Party, declared on November 13, 1959, the demand that the political programs of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels be made the basis of a social democratic program in the year 1959 is so un-Marxist as to be unthinkable. Unquote. The only fully communist society left in the world is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, which is largely considered to be a basket case. Millions starved in the 1990s, and millions more have been sent to concentration camps. With the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama declared that it was the end of history. What he meant by that was that the liberal capitalist democracy was to become the final and sole form of human government. While Fukuyama's contention of an end of history is just as contentious as Marxism's claim of inevitable historical progress. However, what is certainly the case is that the world in 2020 is still waiting for the workers of the world to unite. In nearly every regard, every one of the predictions made by Marxism has not come to pass, or worse, the opposite of those predictions have come to pass. Capitalism did not produce monopolies whose dominance was unassailable. The proletarian are even smaller today than they ever as their prosperity has increased, their sense of class consciousness has declined. Further, there was no global uprising of the proletariat. The communist revolution that was supposed to sweep the world was supposed to begin in the most industrialized nations. Rather, they all began in largely agricultural nations. Further, Marxism predicted that communist societies would be far more productive and far freer than their capitalist counterparts. This prediction has been catastrophically incorrect. By any metric, Marxism does not have a single accurate prediction to its name.